This is the tutorial for Chapter 5, Section 3, the first day on slope-intercept forms. This is a very important section because it helps us graph equations very quickly. And so what we've noticed in the past few sections is that we have a formula or a rule here. We've got y, the output, equals a number being multiplied by x, and I'm going to call it m. And then sometimes we have a number being added to the x term. And when it's in this form, this is very useful for us because it gives us a lot of information about the graph. First of all, it gives us the rate of change. So the rate of change is how much the x value, the input, changes when we go ahead and multiply it by this value. And then sometimes we'll end up adding an extra term to it, and it'll equal the output. We call the rate of change our slope. So when we go ahead and have an equation in this form, it gives us the slope right away, so we know what the rate of change is. This number right here is called our y-intercept. And so they called that the y-intercept because whenever we set x equal to 0, we're left just with what y is. So if I put 0 in place of x, it'll cancel out the m term, the slope, the rate of change, and it'll leave me with y equals b, just the y-intercept alone. So we're really trying to focus on those concepts in this section by just finding what that slope is and writing also what the y-intercept of the graph of each equation. And so in this case, it's in the form we want. So we know that the slope of this line is 3. The y-intercept, which I'll call b, is -5. So again, m represents the rate of change of the slope. B is the y-intercept. On this one, the slope of the line is -5. And again, you can write that as a fraction, -5/1. We're going to use that to help us graph later on. B is 13, is the y-intercept. So again, that could be -5/1 or just -5. Same thing here, 3/1 or just 3. For this one, we have a slope of -1. So the slope's always the number in front of x, or the variable, the input. And in this case, if you don't see a number, you can always put a 1. So -1/1, it's not -1/-1, but -1/1 or just -1. The y-intercept is also the same number, -1. So again, you can treat that as an ordered pair. You can write that as 0, -5, or you can just write it as -5. So in this one, our slope is -11. Our y-intercept is +6. Here, we don't have an x term. So what happened is we have the x term got canceled out because 0 is what the slope has to be if the x term cancels out. So I know my slope is 0 and my y-intercept is -5. Here, the slope of the line is a fraction, 1/2, and the y-intercept is 6. Here we have a decimal as the slope. So our slope of this line is -6 75/100ths, where our y-intercept is 8.54, 8.54. So here the slope's another fraction, -2/3, and the y-intercept is -1/9. Over here again we get the same instance as 5, where what happened is the rate of change canceled out the input, and we're just left with the y-intercept. So what that tells us is the rate of change, or the slope, is 0. The y-intercept is 2 25/100ths. So that's the first type of problem you're going to experience. Let's take a look at the others. Here it says to write an equation of a line given the slope and the y-intercept. So we're going to write it in this form, y equals mx plus b. We have the slope of the line and the y-intercept. And so the rate of change, or the slope of the line, is being multiplied by the input. Adding the y-intercept, the starting value, gives us our output. So when I write this, I'm going to write it as y equals the slope, so -1 times by the input, and then add the starting point, the y-intercept. Again, this could be written just as y equals the opposite of x plus 3. That would mean the same exact thing. So this next one, y equals 4x minus 2. Minus 2 because of that negative sign right there. And here we have y, change that real quick. So y equals -5x minus 8. Again, another negative sign in front of the y-intercept so we can write just minus 8. And that's the same thing as saying y equals negative 5x plus negative 8. It means exactly the same thing. Here we have a y equals, and then we have a decimal, 25/100 x plus 6. And so here we could write this as y equals 0x minus 11, or just y equals negative 11. So whenever it's just y equals a number, that means the slope of the line is 0. Here we have y equals 1x plus 3/8. And so another way to write that is, instead of writing the 1, you can, since every number or every variable is always being multiplied by 1, you could always just write it this way as well. So y equals x plus 3/8. So the last set of directions asks us to write an equation in slope-intercept form for each line. So what we're looking for is we're looking for the slope of the line, first of all, and then the y-intercept. So when I look at this, I look for points where they cross intervals. So like I see one right here, it looks like it crosses where the x and y components or intervals end up crossing. And that looks like it crosses here, here, here. So what's happening is it's going up 2 spaces and over 1 each time. Up 2 over 1, up 2 over 1. So that means the slope of the line is 2 to 1, which is just the same thing as saying 2. The y-intercept is crossing at this point right here, positive 1. So that means the equation of the line would be y equals 2x plus 1. And that's the powerful thing about writing the equation of the line in the slope-intercept form. It gives us the rate of change right away, and it gives us where it starts. And so it's really fast to graph once we understand those concepts. This next one definitely has a slope of 0. So any kind of horizontal line, always has a slope. Horizontal lines have a slope of 0. And so that's a big concept. So m has to be 0. So where it crosses the y-axis, though, is down here at negative 5. So I'm going to write this as y equals 0x minus 5, or I could just write y equals negative 5. So this next one, notice how this line, again, I'm looking for where it crosses the intervals, first of all. So notice how the line is going downhill, down first, then to the right. Down to the right. So that's a negative 1. I had to go down 1 and then over 2 to the right. So the slope is now negative. And it's always going to be a negative slope when it's heading downhill from left to right. So the slope's negative 1. And where does it cross the y-axis? Up here at positive 4. So my answer is y equals negative 1/2 x plus 4. So that's a big concept to look for, especially when you're graphing or trying to write the equation of a line that's given to us. So lines that are positive slope are increasing lines, increasing lines. So what that means is the x value increases as the y value increases. So x increases as y increases. And negative slopes are decreasing lines. And so decreasing line means that as the x values, we'll say x's increase as y's decrease. So as my x value gets bigger, my y value always gets smaller. And that's something to look for when you're trying to figure out what the slope of a line is. So those are the types of problems you'll see on the homework. Good luck.